so it's easier because it can be a little hard.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I stay with me. Yeah, I'll call you back. Good evening. Good evening, everybody. My name is Paul DeHart, and I am the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs here at Vanderbilt Divinity School. I want to welcome all of you to the 2025 Cole Lecture. A bit of history. Philanthropist Edmund W. Cole, president of the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad and treasurer of the Vanderbilt University Board of Trust, endowed the Cole Lecture in 1892. In his words, quote, "for the defense and advocacy of the Christian religion," end quote. Cole's gift provided for the first sustained lectureship in the history of Vanderbilt University. The lectures have been delivered by such distinguished scholars as Harry Emerson Fosdick, George Buttrick, Rudolf Bultmann, H. Richard Niebuhr, Paul Tillich, Walter Brueggemann, Elizabeth Schuster-Fiorenza, James Barr, Gustavo Gutierrez, James Cone, Edward Farley, Don Beiswinger, Jean Tassell, David Buttrick, Jim Wallace, Lamin Saneh, Mark Knoll, Randall Balmer, James Lawson, John O'Malley, R. Scott Appleby, M. Sean Copeland, Willie James Jennings, David Nierenberg, and many others. We are honored that this year's Cole Lecture will be delivered by Professor Jung Mo Sung. Let me say a word or two about our distinguished speaker. Though born in South Korea, Professor Sung is a citizen of Brazil, having lived there since 1966. After obtaining his master's degree in 1988 with a thesis, significantly enough, on theology and foreign debt, he completed his doctorate in religious studies at the Methodist University of Sao Paulo in 1993. Further postdoctoral work followed, thanks to all of which our speaker has been able to assemble a formidable list of publications and talks working at the intersection of theology, economics, and education. Professor Sung has taught at a number of institutions in Brazil, especially the Pontifical Catholic University of Sao Paulo and his long-standing home, the Methodist University of Sao Paulo. And to our good fortune, he is currently a faculty fellow in our school's Winland Cook program in religion and justice. He has authored over 20 books, some of which have been translated into Spanish, Korean, and Italian, as well as 3 books available in English. One of the latter, Beyond the Spirit of Empire, was co-authored with Argentine theologian Nestor Miguez and our own colleague Jörg Rieger, a longtime collaborator. Catholic layperson, Professor Sung is well-traveled and well-known internationally and is regarded as one of the most prominent liberation theologians of his generation. His talk this evening, as you see, is entitled Sacred versus Holy and the Inversion of Ethical Values in the Contemporary World. Please join together to welcome our 2025 co-lecturer, Professor Jung Mo Sung.
Thank you. I kind of nervous. So let's go. First, I would like to thank Vanderbilt University Divinity School and Graduate Program, Department of Religion, for inviting me to give the 2025 call lecture. Second, I would like to apologize for my English. I'm grateful for your understanding. I hope that with your patience and goodwill, we can establish a good dialogue. When I received the invitation to give the call lecture, I saw the names of Gustavo Gutierrez and Henrique Dussel, esteemed Latin American liberation theologians, on the list of previous lecture, and I am honored to be included. We live in a time of so many political and cultural divisions and polarizations that they make it almost impossible to build a global social consensus to address the two great crises of our time, the profound social inequality and the environmental crisis. In building a new global social consensus, we need a common ethical principles from which we can discuss strategies for action. Until recently, we agreed on the notion of the human dignity, of international solidarity, and of human rights. However, the world has changed. Take, for example, Elon Musk's famous interview on the podcast, The Joe Rogan Experience, February 2025, where he said, "The fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy. The exploitation of empathy. They are exploiting a flaw in Western civilization, which is the empathetic response. And I think empathy is good, but you need to think carefully and not be programmed like a robot," unquote. Of course, many people criticize him, especially for the most shocking phrase, quote, "The fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy," unquote, while many others agree with him. The interpretation of this concept of empathy is one of the fundamental points in the political cultural war we are in and deserves reflection. Firstly, empathy is the ability to see things from another person's perspective and feel their emotions. According to Michael Tomasello, professor of psychology and neurosciences, says, quote, "Cognitively speaking, the biological heritage of humans is very similar to that of the other primates. There's only one major difference, which is that humans identify with their peers more deeply than other primates. This identification is not something mysterious, but simply the process by which human children understand that other people are being like themselves in a way that inanimate objects are not, for example, and therefore sometimes try to understand things from their point of view," unquote. I need to change my glass. In this sense, empathy is not an ethical quality, but something natural. Therefore, we consider it an anomaly when someone is unable to understand the communicative intentions of others and to feel emotions from other people's perspective. In other words, a person without empathy is incapable of seeing and understanding social reality. That is why interview Musk says, quote, "I think empathy is good," unquote, but the problem arises when society responds, or as he criticized, is programmed to react to empathy like a robot. In this sense, he interprets the empathy that leads a person to act in favor of those in need as something negative, not the result of freedom, but rather as a robot or servant. In response to the interviewer's comment, he explained that empathy is being used as a weapon. In other words, the problem is not empathy itself, but rather empathy as weapon. Meanwhile, Tomasello, following Piaget's lines of thought, says that moral reasoning is about empathizing with other people and being able to see and feel things from their point of view, unquote. Here we have two aspects or moments of empathy. A, understanding and seeing the intention and emotion of the others, and B, responding positively or negatively to the intention and joy and suffering of the other. Here we have the aspect of knowledge and that of ethical choice. What Musk and others criticize is the ethical dimension, that of responding in intersubjective and social relationships with empathy or compassion. With this, we have a fundamental ethical reversal. What the West has called empathy, compassion, or the Christian tradition, love of neighbor, is no longer seen as a good, but rather as a weakness. In other words, in addition to reversing the relationship between good and evil, it shifts the ethical discussion of good and evil to the field of power, weakness, and strength or power. That is, replacing the criterion of ethics with that of the will to power. On the other side of the polarization, we see in this political cultural war, it is worth recalling an interview given by Chomsky on the Democracy Now! Podcast in 2018, which can help us better understand the complexity of our time. He says, "I don't know what word in the language, I can't find one, that applies to people of that kind, who are willing to sacrifice the literal, the existence of the organized human life, not in the distant future, so they can put a few more dollars in highly overstuffed pockets. The word evil doesn't begin to approach it," unquote. This famous intellectual and linguists recognize the limitation of modern and postmodern reason in dealing with this process of reversing what is good and evil. I would like to propose here the hypothesis that the concept of sacrifice may be a path to the answer. This concept, sacrifice, which comes from the field of religion and is discussed in religious studies and theology in general, has been used by some of the leading thinkers of Latin American liberation theology to analyze the economic and political logic of the contemporary world. Sacrifice is precisely the action that reverses the usual understanding of the relationship between good and evil, and suspends, in the name of the sacred, social political rationality and ethics in the economic political field. In this sense, we can say that we cannot understand what's happening in our time without using a theological critical rationality. Thus, the question we can ask here is, how can theology contribute to the construction of new social consensus around what is truth and good that overcomes the current polarization and the state of cultural war, where the other is seen as an enemy to be defeated or killed? Joan Robson, an important economist, of the 20th century, in her book, Economic Philosophy, published in the early 1960s, says something that marked me in my training as a theologian and scholar of religions in the modern world. Quote, "It's precisely the pursuit of profit which destroys the prestige of businessmen. While wealth can buy all form of respect, it never finds them freely given. It was the task of economists to overcome this sentiment and justify the ways of mammon to man. No one likes to have a bad conscience. Pure cynicism is rather rare. Even the thugs robbed and murdered for the honor of their goddess. It's the business of the economist not to tell us what to do, but to show why what we are doing anyway is in accord with proper principles." Unquote. From this rather provocative quote, I want to highlight the relationship between the bad conscience and sacrifice. In Robinson's statement that, quote, "even the thugs," what is that? Group of professional criminals, devotees of Kali, who robbed and murdered travelers in northern India until the mid of the 18th century. So thugs robbed and murdered for the honor of their goddess. Unquote. The word sacrifice does not appear explicitly, but rather murder, because it's a statement from someone who does not believe in the religions of the thugs. Therefore, she describes and interprets the death of the defeated as murder and not as sacrifice. But for the thugs, these deaths are sacrificial, that is, obedience to the demand of the goddess. For when one kills in the name of the gods, death is interpreted as sacrifice, something good and necessary, and not murder. Death is a fact. Whether it's a murder or sacrifice is the result of a theological interpretation. Similarly, for many Christians, the death in the process of colonization, slavery, and exclusion of the poor from the market are seen as sacrifice demanded by God or for the progress of civilization. It is in this context that the role of religion and theology is to justify the path to greater wealth and power for the dominant class. However, why do people and society need to justify this death and pillage through the notion of sacrifice? Wouldn't it be enough to simply take what they want without a guilty conscience, just as we eat meat and at a meal? For Robinson, they need to justify it because, quote, "no one likes to have a bad conscience. Pure cynicism is rather rare," unquote. For, as we have seen above, pure cynicism is a form of anomaly in the process of human evolution. As neuroscientists and evolutionary anthropologists say, our ability to empathize is a building block of our sociality and morality. The notion of bad conscience presupposes the difference between a good and bad conscience, that is, a process of ethical discernment. The question that arises then is, how is the criterion for a discernment between good and bad conscience discovered or constructed? Would it be a discovery of truth and goodness purely revealed by gods or enlightened beings, or result solely of the cultural process in which the victorious group would impose their views of truth and goodness on the defeated? The social and personal need for religious justification or pseudo-scientific ideology in the face of death, oppressive relationship and murder in all parts of the world shows us that we are dealing with something that is prior to or underlying the sphere of cultural and economic political relations. However, this does not necessarily lead us to the hypothesis of divine revelation. In my process of studying this relationship between what is natural, what is cultural, and what religions speak of as revelation enlightenment, a book by the Dalai Lama helped me a lot. In his book, Ethics for the New Millennium, the Dalai Lama says, when I speak of basic human feelings, I'm not only thinking of something fleeting or vague, however. I refer to the capacity we all have to empathize with one another, which in Tibetan we call, I cannot pronounce that, translated literally, this means the inability to bear the sight of another's suffering. Given that this is what enables us to enter into and to some extent participate in others' pain. It is one of our most significant characteristics. It is what causes us to start at the sound of cry for help, to recoil at the sight of the harm done to another, to suffer when confronted with others' suffering. And it's what compels us to shut our eyes even when we want to ignore others' distress. Unquote. This last statement by Dalai Lama is important. There is a conflict between the desire to ignore the suffering of others and physical experience of empathy. Seeing and feeling the suffering of others make us participate in their suffering. It's impossible to understand what's happening to another person without simultaneously feeling their suffering or joy in our own skin. That's why we close our eyes to try to deny empathy or compassion, to avoid suffering for the suffering of others. We can close our eyes, but we cannot help feeling empathy. This compulsion to close our eyes shows that empathy is a human characteristic. What a person can do against this dynamic of empathy is to reduce the impact of the suffering of others on themselves by reducing their social sensitivity. This is what this is what Pope Francis has to strongly criticize as the social insensitivity that has been globalized by neoliberal culture. As social inequality and the social exclusion of the poor deepen, we see a conflict between the desire for unlimited enrichment, which is the spirit of current neoliberal capitalism, and empathy, which is one of the primary emotions of the human species. It's in this context that we are dealing here with what John Hobson referred to as the bad conscience of the ruling class of our time. Bad conscience is a reflection of the first movement of the human beings who, faced with this desire to go toward mammon, knows that this goal will cost suffering of many and of himself, and even the future of civilization. This is the theme of evil mentioned by Chomsky. The second movement is to block within oneself a force that comes from the empathetic process itself. That is, the greedy individuals has to react against the natural force of empathy and reaffirm their desire, which deep down they know is bad for themselves and others in the relationship. It is the tension between primary empathy and self-affirmation of their desire to have what belongs to others, the result of envy, mimesis, and greed. We find this theme of covet in the 10th commandment given by Yahweh in the book of Exodus. In the third moment, we have the intervention of what is good and evil, and inversion that is justified by gods who demand sacrifice of human lives. In the process of recognizing oneself as a human being, the individual discovers that he is an individual to the extent that he learns to understand what the other individual is expressing and feeling. Thus, what the modern Western world calls an individual is actually someone who is in relationship with other people in a community. This means that the notion of their dignity only appears in the recognition of the dignity of others. However, this pedagogical process contradicts their greed and desire for power, a spiritual force that goes against empathy and compassion. It's at this point that the need for a justification for sacrifice in name of God arises. As Isaiah Berlin reminds us in his dialogue with Kant's thought, quote, to what could a human being sacrificed? Only to something which is superior to, more authoritative, more valuable than that human beings, unquote. And for believers of the past and present, the gods and their sacred texts are superior and transcendental to humans. For Kant, this was blasphemy. For liberation theologians and Pope Francis and Pope Leo XIV, it is the idolatry of money that dominates today's world. In analyzing Joan Robson's statement, I focus on the more psychosocial aspect of the intersubjective relationships of the issues of sacrifice and the bad conscience and individual and society. Now, I want to bring up a thesis by Max Weber on sacrifice in the modern world. When addressing the impossibility of science to discern between the values of different cultures, Weber says, just as the Greek would bring a sacrifice at one time to Aphrodite and at another to Apollo, and above all to the gods of his own city, people like us today only know the gods have been deprived, only now the gods have been deprived of the magical and mythical, but inward true qualities that giving them such vivid immediacy. Unquote. First, it must be clear that for Weber, one of the characteristics of the modern world is the process of disenchantment of the world. However, this concept does not mean that the modern world has become secularized in the sense that the notion of God has lost importance in society. Weber points out that all society, whether pre-modern or modern, need to have a God, whether personal or impersonal, for example, free market in neoliberalism or the communist state in the former Soviet Union. This is because without a sacred principle and its sacred value, social systems cannot sustain themselves. That is, the ultimate foundation of the social system is always something sacred, in the name of which sacrifice of human lives can be demanded. On the other hand, a transformation of a social system or a social revolution requires a new God. That's why Weber analyzed how the emergence of capitalism also meant the emergence of a new spirit, the spirit of capitalism. At the risk of repeating something that is already well known, I'd like to quote Weber's famous text here. Quote, in fact, the summum bonum of this ethic appears entirely transcendental and absolutely irrational. Man is dominated by the making of money, by acquisition as the ultimate purpose of his life. Economic acquisition is no longer subordinate to man as the mean for the satisfaction of his material needs. This reversal of what we should call the natural relationship, so irrational from the naive point of view, is definitely a leading principle of capitalism, as it is foreign to all people not under capitalist influence, unquote. With the emergence of a new spirit and a new transcendental and irrational principle, something that does not need to be justified just rationally, we have a new principle of justification for sacrifices. What we are seeing in this political cultural war our time is exactly a war of the gods. In view of this, we must remember that these gods and their promised heavens or paradise are not entities that are somewhere outside the universe. As Franz Hinckelhammer, one of the most important critical thinkers in the tradition of liberation theology, says, quote, the heaven has a history just like the earth. When the earth changes, the heaven changes, for the simple reason that heaven is a human imagination based on the earth. Heaven is, in a certain sense, and most of the time, an unconscious human project. This is particularly true of the Christian tradition, in which the project of human society appears through the anticipation of heaven on earth. There are not changes without a projection of what will be, since what will be is always derived as an anticipation of heaven on earth. The struggle for power on earth is always a struggle for heaven. This means that we need to delve into the theological discussion about the gods and their image of paradise. Both in modern Western theology and in religious studies, there is not much discussion about the concept of the struggle between gods or sacred beings. The best known opposition is the relationship between faith, God, versus atheism, secularization, and the sacred versus the profane or secular world. For reasons of time, I will not discuss here the problem of the various names of God and their conception that we find in the world, but I will focus on the possibility of an ethical theological principle that can be applied. A, as a criterion for discerning between what is true good and what is false evil. B, within the struggle of the gods in our time. C, and that can be used for any religion or segment of a particular religion. That is a criterion that transcends cultural and religious difference and allows for dialogue and alliance in the struggle. To this end, I want to begin with the problem of understanding the term sacred as synonymous with holy. The title of Rudolf Otto's classic book, Das Heilig, from 1917, can be translated into the other Western language as the sacred or the holy. This is because in German there are no two distinct words as we have in their other Western language to distinguish these two ideas. Thus, the English translator opted for the notion of holy, the idea of the holy, as did the Spanish version, lo santo, while the Italian, il sacro, the French, le sacré, and the Portuguese, o sagrado, choose another path. Without getting into a discussion here about the theoretical and commercial reasons that led translators and publishers to choose one of the two options, we can say that for the vast majority of scholars in the religious field, the notion of sacred and holy are considered synonymous. Even when it comes to religious experience and not just a place, object, or ritual, it's common to use sacred and holy interchangeably. Let us take an example, a statement by Hubert and Moss in their book, Sacrifice, Its Nature and Function. Quote, "The place of the ceremony must itself be sacred. Outside the holy place, immolation is mere murder." Unquote. Here we have the use of the term sacred and holy as synonymous, and the direct relationship between sacrifice and the metamorphosis of murder into a beneficial and saving action. In all human societies, a murder or the avoidable death of a child is unacceptable to any moral code, except when the death is interpreted as a sacrifice demanded by the gods, whether those gods have anthropomorphic or impersonal characteristics. I would like to give a very concrete example of this question of the sacred and sacrifice within modern economics. Paul Anthony Samuelson, winner of 1970 Nobel Prize in Economics, in his famous book, Economics, which sold more than 4 million copies, says that in the capitalist market system, which is impersonal, quote, "Goods go where there are most votes or dollars. John Rockefeller's dog may receive the milk that a poor child needs to avoid rickets. Why? Because supply and demand are working badly? No, because they are doing what they are designed to do, putting goods in the name of those who can pay the most." Unquote. The ethical or political issues in capitalist society is to discuss whether the result of market logic should be modified because of social inequality and the social consequence, or B, whether it should be accepted without question because it considers the free market to be its sacred, as proposed by neoliberals and those who don't accept the notion of human rights, including social rights. This sacred is, by definition, something unquestionable and irrational, in the sense that it's beyond rational or profane logic. If all social systems are founded on sacred principles that are unquestionable within their system, one can only radically criticize the dominant system to the extent that it denies the existing sacred principle in the name of another system that is also sacred. This is what Mircea Eliade is referring to when he speaks of the history of religion. Quote, "The history of religions is in large part the history of the devaluation and re-evaluation of the process of manifestation of the sacred." Unquote. The problem is that this recognition that the history of religions and society is the result of these struggles between gods and what is considered sacred is not enough for us to face the challenge of our time. Simply recognizing that we are in the midst of a war, of opposing or conflicting conception of the sacred, does not give us the criteria to choose the best possible path for the future of humanity. We need a criterion that differentiates between a notion of the sacred, which with its unquestionable laws demand the sacrifice of human lives, and a sacred or other concept that defends the right of human beings to live with dignity. We can find this question in affirmation by Hannah Arendt in her book, The Human Condition. Quote, The reason why life asserts itself as the ultimate point of reference in the modern age and has remained the highest good of modern society is that the modern reversal operated within the fabric of Christian society, whose fundamental belief in the sacredness of life has survived, and thus even remained completely unshaken by secularization and the general declines of Christian faith, unquote. In this quote, we find a criterion that she calls sacred, similar to Kant's thesis that the only ultimately valuable things in the universe is the individual human beings, unquote. We can see that there are two concepts of sacred, the best known, which we find in Eliade, Hubert, Moss, and many other contemporary scholars in the field of religion and theology, and the one Arendt points out. The concept of sacred, articulate with that of sacrifice, is one that establishes boundaries of separate space, time, rights, and people from the sphere of the sacred and profane. The notion of the sacred in its explication is always associated with the system that allows the reproduction of the life of a social group, and at the same time establishes who has the right to live with pleasure and dignity and who are considered inferior, both in terms of right and recognition of their dignity. Like any classification system, there are people or groups that are considered outside the limits of humanity. For example, slaves or untouchables in caste system. It's in rebellion against the logic of sacred that Arendt and other modern thinkers speak of a notion of the sacred that goes beyond the sacralized system and places the life of human beings as sacred. The question is how to avoid confusion in the dialogue, and most importantly, how to operationalize the use of this concept of human life as sacred in the struggle of sacred. Inspired by Levinas's proposal, the distinction between the sacred and the holy, and that of liberation theology, which opposes the God of life and the idol, I would like to offer some preliminary reflections on the notion of the holy. To this end, I would like to cite two passages from the Gospel to clarify the difference between the sacred and the holy. The first is the well-known passage of the Good Samaritan. Both the priest and the Levite, who are people of the sacred, when they saw the fallen man, quote, passed by on the other side, unquote. This description of these two men passing by on the other side is important for us to understand the logic of the sacred. A sacred people, they know that if they come into contact with this fallen man, they will become impure. Their entire worldview and self-image is marked by the logic of pure versus impure and obedience to these laws. Their salvation and that of Israel depends on the obedience to the laws of purity. On the other hand, the Samaritan, who is considered by Jews to be impure by definition, goes out of his way to approach the fallen man and care for him. And Jesus said that when he saw, he took pity of him. That is, he had a different reaction from the priest and the Levite. All three understood the situation and the pain of the fallen man, which is the first moment of empathy. But the difference was in their reaction. The two sacred men, obeying the sacred law, moved away to separate themselves, while Samaritan, moved by compassion, approached and cared for him. If they had to explain their action, the sacred man would use sacrificial and insensitive theology, while Samaritan might have difficulty justify his action theologically, even in terms of religion of Samaria. He was moved by a force that in Christian theological terms we can call the Holy Spirit. Just as there is the spirit of the sacred that moves people and society toward the logic of selfishness or concentration and therefore inequality of power and wealth, we also have a spirit that we can call a Holy Spirit, a spirit that leads people on a path that begins with empathy and passes through compassion and action of solidarity with those who are suffering. An important point of difference between the logic of sacred and the holy is the theme of self-giving. In the logic of sacrifice, the main relationship is one of obedience to the law and the demands of the gods. Their worshippers only accept these demands in exchange for promised benefits. And if, by chance, these rewards are not delivered, these sacrifices are seen as vain. On the other hand, in the logic of the holy, for example, in the case of the Good Samaritan, his action does not come from an external demand, but rather from a free choice that comes from within. Furthermore, this action of compassion and solidarity is valuable in itself. That is, it does not depend on the positive result. Of course, these people want the best possible result, but the validity of the action does not depend on it. In this sense, the attitude and action of holiness are marked by freedom and experience of gratitudeness or grace. The second example is the healing of men with leprosy. Faced with this man who asked Jesus for healing, the Gospel of Matthew says, quote, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I'm willing, he said, be clean. Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy, unquote. Usually, people talk more about Jesus' power to heal or, in enlightened environment, the need to demystify this type of narrative as something mythical and implausible in the modern enlightened world. What I want to draw attention to in this text is that Jesus touched the man with leprosy, an untouchable person, completely impure, totally opposed to the sacred, before healing him. It's not the miracle of healing that allows Jesus to touch him, as established by sacred law, but rather his recognition that this man, considered untouchable by culture and the gods, is also worthy of being touched by other human beings and thus recognized as human. By touching the man with leprosy, Jesus reveals the signs of the presence of the kingdom of God in history. The presence of God who does not differentiate between people no matter how much they are treated by society as unclean or untouchable. However, Jesus knows that one cannot live in society without rules. Therefore, he asked the healed man, quote, go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them, unquote. Jesus knows that in a society it's necessary to have rules for social coexistence, but he criticized the sacred logic of identifying a situation or place in the social division of labor of a person or group with their level of what we can call human dignity. This theme is fundamental in our time because deep down, the great political cultural struggle of our time is precisely between those who defend the fundamental equality of all human beings and those who defend the classification of human beings into superior, inferior, and subhumans, thus justifying the profound social inequality of our time. This classification of human beings, whether between free and slaves, faithful and unfaithful, pure and impure, is part of the very logic of the sacred and is the most common form in human history. In the West, it was Christianity that brought the banner of the fundamental equality among all people in the name of God who makes no distinction. In the 20th century, with the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we saw a major international movement to build a social consensus on equality. Fundamental equality was the basis for the struggle for human rights, in line with civil, political, and social rights. What we see in our time is what Hinkelamits called the rebellion against equality. The struggle to defend essential inequality between social class, race, cultures, religions, gender, and sexuality is a struggle that is justified in the name of sacred or God, which in biblical tradition would be called an idol. Thus, we find a connection between the logic of caste, the division and classification of human beings, and the logic of the social division of labor. For studies of caste system show, they are linked to the social division of labor, that is, the system of production and distribution of wealth. In social analysis of the modern thought, whether liberal or Marxist, the role and function of subject within a social system are the most important issue. This is because with the assumption of a fundamental equality of all human beings, the focus is on the functionality or transformation of the social system. However, neoliberal thinking and neo-fascism deny the fundamental equality of all human beings. Thus, in addition to the issue of social rules and functions, we need to revisit the topic of caste. According to Isabel Wilkinson, quote, like other old house, America has an unseen skeleton, a caste system that is central to its operation. Caste is the infrastructure of our division. It's the architecture of human hierarchy, the subconscious code of instruction for maintaining, in our case, a 400 years social order. Unquote. Furthermore, all versions of castes that we have had in history were based on, quote, stigmatizing those deemed inferior to justify the dehumanization necessary to keep the lowest ranking people at the bottom and to rationalize the protocols of enforcement, unquote. And all this system, whether in the pre-modern or modern world, survive because, quote, it's justified as divine will originating from sacred text or the presumed laws of nature, reinforced through the culture and passes down through the generation, unquote. To advance this theme of social rule and caste system in this time of alliance between neoliberalism, neo-fascism, and unequal religions, I would like to mention the Indian thinker Ambedkar, a Dalit formerly known as Untouchables, who had the opportunity to study at Columbia University in New York, earning his doctorate in 1927, and the London School of Economics. When discussing the relationship between the modern economy and caste in his best-known book, Annihilation of Caste, written in 1936, he says, quote, "The caste system is not merely a division of labor, it's also a division of laborers. Civilized society undoubtedly needs a division of labor, but but in no civilized society is division of labor accompanied by unnatural division of laborer into watertight compartments. The caste system is not merely a division of laborers, which is quite different from division of labor. It's a hierarchy in which the division of laborers are graded great one above the others." Unquote. In this caste system, those at the bottom are necessary for the functioning of the system and the privilege of those at the top. First, without these inferiors, there would be no workers willing to do the dirty, dangerous, and very poorly paid jobs. Second, the justification for the privilege of those at the top demands on society acceptance that those on the margins of exclusion, the impure, deserve their suffering. In the struggle against the caste system, Ambedkar says something important for our reflection. Caste among non-Hindus has no religious consecration, but among Hindus, most decidedly it has. Among non-Hindus, caste is only a practice, not a sacred institution. They did not originate it. With them, it's only a survival mechanism. They do not regard caste as a religious dogma. Religion compels the Hindus to treat isolation and segregation of caste as a virtue. Whether in Ambedkar India or in the cultural spiritual struggle of our time, this form of dehumanization and labor exploitation against the so-called inferiors, we must not fall into the error of criticizing only the bad intention or intentionality of the individual. There are many people who defend this unjust and inhuman system because they are deeply religious. There is an idolatrous system within which religiosity is lived. The problem lies in the dominant religious cultural structure that teaches them to be insensitive to the suffering of the victims. After the argument presented so far, let us return to the Elon Musk statement. The fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy. Unquote. The role of theologians and followers of God of life is to recover the notion of good and truth, which have been imprisoned by injustice. In today's world, those who show solidarity with those who suffer are accused of being weak. But through faith in Jesus, we know that when you are weak in this way, you are truly strong. Thank you.
Hi, folks. We'll be taking some questions. Oh, you got it.
Okay. Thank you. My question is, in a climate of neoliberal desensitization, what is the role of theological institutions to sensitize the church?
Yeah.
Okay.
Eu posso falar em português também.
No, yeah. It's a very difficult question because it depends on what we're talking about, which institution you are talking. I think you have to understand that church, Christian church, has two missions. First is to pronounce, to talk, to spread the good news for kingdom. Okay? In order to do that, we need church institution. And since the 4th century, church got some kind of prestigious and privilege. And something that we like. Priest, pastor, of course, like to be treated as a special person, sacred person. And to get this good recognition, we need to keep in sacred logic. So we have to go beyond the sacred, go beyond of this normal desire to be treated as a personal, special, and go to the holy logic. But this is something holy problem. Usually, so holy person do that. Sacred person not. So we cannot ask for majority of the church professionals to be holy. I really like Bible, even is not from God, because very real perspective. And the history of the Bible shows us that prophet, a minority. That is. So we can keep our mission, calling, to show or to teach, to discuss with the church and Christianity to show, okay, we need church and we need to be more holy. And yeah, but the people are not like that. The church, yes. We know that we are all sinners. Holiness is not be holy. Holiness is to accept that all we are sinners. Only God is holy.
Say that again, please.
Yeah, so we are all, so good idea that only God is holy. That being sinner is not problem. We use the concept of sinner to exclude people from the church, the society, the right to have family. No, because you're a sinner. Yes, what's the problem? Everyone is sinner.
Yes.
No, yeah, God said that. I'm Christian. Jesus said, only God is holy. That is. So no problem being sinner. So we are holy when we recognize that we are sinner, so we cannot exclude others, sinners. We can be part of the community, a lot of sinners, and sinners create problems. So because of that, we need kind of repentance and merciful relationship. So, but God should change. Okay, but Jesus died on the cross. Even Jesus couldn't do that. How can we say that we should do? You try to be more holy, more merciful. That is. This is not the answer for solution, but this is how can you deal with the real world and real church.
Thank you.
No question. Oh.
Francisco.
Thank you, Dr. Sung. Obrigado for your a lot of questions, about what you shared, and I'm just thinking about how so much of some of these statements and quotes that you offered, we can sort of cut and paste them and see how they have direct application now, right, in the context of growing fascism, right, attacks on democracy, attacks on human dignity, all across, in this country. And I'm just wondering, I mean, this is more of a I guess a personal, but also a theological question, given that you come from, your formation is in the Brazilian context under many years of dictatorship, right? 21 years or so of dictatorship. If there's anything that you see, you see any connections between that and, this growing authoritarianism today and how we get past the sacred logic, right? The sacred logic that dehumanizes and excludes.
I don't want to discuss in United States about the United States because I have no element information of that. But I think I want to talk about neoliberalism. You are talking now. A lot of people saying neoliberalism is over, and because change the economic discussion, etc. I think neoliberalism is not about economics. It's a project of new civilization. Margaret Thatcher in 1981, when she was prime minister, she said, "What I'm doing is not economical project. What we want to do is to change heart and soul of the nation. And for that, we need economics." Okay? And what is the new civilization? There is no human right. There is no human dignity. There's only contract in the market. This is a Hayek text. You have to go to the philosophical foundation of neoliberal. Economics requires adaptation, and so with China, new technology, okay, to change. But the idea that there is no dignity, the notion of dignity, because the notion of dignity presupposes there is something that gave you dignity. Nature, Hayek said, no. God, please, God is not part of the discussion. There is no dignity. There is no human right. Now, who say about that? United Nations and Christianity, especially WCC, World Council of Church. Because of that, von Mises, the professor of the Hayek, criticized WCC, World. In 1951, he said, discussion from the World Council of Church doesn't make sense. There is nothing. This only thing that we have is the contract of the market. Because of that, we have to come back to the discussion of what is something essential in humanity. But modern reason about European philosophy knows that, no, it's over, okay. The idea is that there is no essence, or there's something, truth, that's postmodern, is good for neoliberal philosophers. Hayek discussed the postmodern philosophy and the complex system of the nature in 1950s. So, okay, you have criticized modern philosophy, you have dialogue. So why European philosophers talk about against reason was so supported by system? because they are talking, yeah, there's nothing. So and we need some philosopher can say, I don't care because I'm paid with the university. Okay. But if they don't get money, paycheck, they're going to, oh, where is the justice? And justice is market. The justice of market replaces the idea of universal right. So this theological discussion, we have come back to advertising. One of my book that was published in Portuguese, Idolatry of Money and Human Right, is in process of translation, and they will publish it next year. And it discusses about how neoliberalism is completely opposite, a change of the neoliberal idea. So we can say that in the United States, Democrats, a part of them talk about in terms of modern liberal idea. And our Democrats and Republican people think in terms of neoliberal idea, there's no human right or market. And within the neoliberals are people who are more civilized, let's go in a civilized way, and there are more no shame to say what to do. Yeah, that is. So we have kind of the distance, conflict between the neoliberal groups. That is so.
I think we have time for one more question from the audience.
Oh,
Yes.
there are a couple.
How do I do this? I wonder.
I know.
You're not a friend of mine, are you?
I'm not a theologian, so forgive me
Yeah.
immediately for this. Apologies. My question, this was wonderful. Thank you. A lot of food for thought. I'm thinking with technology, AI, you talk about human dignity. When artificial intelligence is coming into the fray, and we are essentialized by our intelligence rather than by our humanity, and corporations own everything, and people don't. How do you think about this as another factor in this world? Thank you.
Yeah. I finished a small book on liberation theology and artificial intelligence. But it's for Portuguese. Yeah, and discuss about what is the method of liberation theology, because I'm almost 70, and I have to do something for next generation, next and the next or other, because it's hard to find young people discussing this question. And so try to become. Liberation theology is method, is not content, first. Second, how you can discuss this new content, or keep content in new society with neoliberal system and artificial intelligence. New society, or any kind of society, neoliberal or others, need kind of utopia. Utopia has in two dimensions. First, we need to think about the future and what is now, and utopia is something that we desire, kind of give me fascination, ideas, and the all-time desire is immortal life. Since that human species, realize that is death, is something after death, the question, which or who can give us this good life? That is all kind of religions, yeah? Now, with artificial intelligence, no, we don't need this. Artificial intelligence, the real God can offer us. In order to get that, we need a kind of technology. And so, of course, we need concentration of wealth, money, to to get this technology. Now is justified the exclusion and concentration of wealth and tax. That's important. The tax for the less tax for the rich people, because rich really can concentrate and to give us the immortal life. So we need to talk, of course, understand what's happening in terms of technological change in the life and work in the company, etc. But this culture, then they are now it says now we have to distinguish post-human. Have you heard about that? Yeah, post-organic human being. Change, mix it from body and technology. And so we have inferior human being, only organic. And among the organic human beings, of course, there are lowest of them. So it comes back to the question of the caste. Because of, studying about the artificial intelligence, okay, you have the same, because anthropological issues is always present. The difference is how you to answer for the desire of the powerful, and you answer for the suffering of the low people. That is about. And then we can have to Christian faith or other religion that understand that the good idea of good God, merciful God, comes from our nature, empathy. Yeah, how you deal with empathy, and which kind of religion and culture can offer us the struggle, the weapon to overcome this. In the second level, after empathy, what I can do that? I'm going against suffering of the others, or I need spirit. Bible says, Gospels talk about the spirit of the word of the sin and the spirit, Holy Spirit. Not because third Trinity, God, but the good spirit that keeps us human being and accept we can die. Yes. Maybe you should die in a compassionate way with others, and hope, it is faith, that beyond that there is a God who is merciful and by grace gives us our resurrected word. Thank you.
Let's thank Professor Jung Mo Sung, please. Don't run off just yet, please. We have a reception right next door, so please join us right over there for a little bit more food and drink. So.